Carthage, North Africa, 146 BC. A 12-year-old girl stands on the walls of her city, watching 50,000 Roman soldiers surround her home. She's been standing here for 3 years. 3 years of siege. 3 years of starvation. 3 years watching her city slowly die. She doesn't know it yet, but in 6 days, she'll witness something so horrific that Roman historians themselves will refuse to write the full details. Something so brutal that for 2,000 years, scholars have argued about whether it actually happened or if it was too evil to be real. Her name is lost to history. But what happened to her and 50,000 other survivors of Carthage is not. Because when Rome finally broke through those walls, they didn't just conquer the city. They erased it. They killed every man. They enslaved every woman and child. Then they burned the city for 17 days straight until nothing remained but ash. But that's not the war crime. The war crime came after. When Rome decided that destroying Carthage wasn't enough. They needed to make sure it could never rise again. So they did something that ancient writers could barely bring themselves to describe. Something that violates every conception of warfare, even by ancient standards. I'm Stripped History, and today we're uncovering the atrocity that Rome tried to bury under 2,000 years of propaganda. If you want to hear the stories that ancient civilizations deliberately erased from their histories, subscribe to this channel. Because what comes next is so disturbing that Roman senators debated for decades whether they'd gone too far. And most of them decided they hadn't. To understand what happened at Carthage, you need to understand why Rome hated this city with an obsession that bordered on madness. Carthage wasn't just another enemy. It was Rome's nightmare. For over 100 years, these two civilizations had fought 3 separate wars called the Punic Wars. Carthage had nearly destroyed Rome multiple times. In 216 BC, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca led an army, including 37 war elephants, over the Alps mountains and into Italy. He defeated Roman armies 4 times in massive battles. At the Battle of Cannae, Hannibal's forces killed between 50,000 and 70,000 Roman soldiers in a single afternoon. That's more Roman soldiers dead in one day than America lost in the entire Vietnam War. Rome had never been so close to complete annihilation. The Senate genuinely believed the Republic would fall. Mothers in Rome started drowning their children rather than let them be captured by Carthaginian forces. But Rome survived. Barely. And Rome never forgot. For the next 70 years, even after defeating Hannibal, even after Carthage sued for peace and agreed to pay massive tribute, even after Carthage destroyed its own military and became essentially a trading city with no threat to anyone, Rome still couldn't let it go. One Roman senator named Cato the Elder became obsessed with destroying Carthage. He ended every single speech he gave in the Senate, no matter what the topic was, with the same phrase. Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. He was talking about taxes. Carthage must be destroyed. Discussing road construction. Carthage must be destroyed. Debating farming regulations. Carthage must be destroyed. For years, he said this. Every single speech. And eventually, Rome listened. In 149 BC, Rome declared war on Carthage for the 3rd time. But this wasn't a normal war. Rome's Senate made it clear from the beginning, this time, they would not accept surrender. They would not accept tribute. They would not accept peace. They would accept nothing less than total annihilation. The Roman general Scipio Aemilianus led 80,000 soldiers to North Africa with one order: erase Carthage from existence. The siege of Carthage lasted 3 years. 3 years. Think about that. 3 years of being surrounded, cut off from all supply routes, slowly starving. Carthage's population at the start of the siege was approximately 200,000 people. By the end, only 50,000 remained alive. 150,000 people died during the siege. Not from battle. From starvation, disease, and desperation. Ancient sources describe what happened inside the city during those 3 years, and the details are nightmare fuel. By year 2, all the animals were gone. Every horse, every donkey, every dog, every cat, every rat. All eaten. By year 3, people were eating leather. Sandals. Belts. Shields. Anything made from animal hide was boiled and consumed. The Roman historian Appian writes that desperate Carthaginians dug up graves looking for any organic matter they could consume. Parents stopped feeding their children because there wasn't enough food. They made a calculation: save the adults who can fight, let the children starve. Streets were filled with the bodies of children too weak to move. And through it all, Rome just waited outside the walls. Watching. Starving them out. In spring of 146 BC, Scipio decided the city had suffered enough. He ordered the final assault. 80,000 Roman soldiers attacked from every direction simultaneously. The Carthaginians, weakened from starvation, couldn't hold them back. Rome broke through the walls. What happened next took 6 days. The Romans moved through the city street by street, building by building, room by room. This wasn't a battle. This was systematic extermination. Every man they found was killed immediately. Sword to the throat. No prisoners. No mercy. Every woman and child was chained and dragged to holding areas to be processed for slavery. But here's what makes it even more horrific: Carthage was a vertical city. Most buildings were 6 to 7 stories tall, connected by narrow streets. The Romans had to fight their way up each building, floor by floor. Families barricaded themselves on upper floors. The Romans would set the lower floors on fire and wait for them to either burn to death or jump. Ancient sources describe the streets becoming so filled with bodies that Roman soldiers couldn't walk. They had to climb over piles of corpses to advance. For 6 days, this continued. House to house. Family by family. Floor by floor. The screaming never stopped. Appian writes that Scipio himself, standing on a hill watching his army methodically destroy the city, reportedly wept. One of his officers asked why he was crying when he was achieving the greatest victory of his career. Scipio replied, "I weep for Carthage. Because I know that one day, someone will do this to Rome." He was right. But that's a different story. On the 7th day, the killing stopped. Not because Rome showed mercy, but because there was no one left to kill. 50,000 survivors, almost entirely women and children, were chained together in the city's main plaza. They would be marched to Roman slave markets and sold to the highest bidders. But Rome still wasn't satisfied. The Senate had given Scipio specific orders: don't just defeat Carthage. Make it so Carthage can never exist again. So he burned it. For 17 days, Roman soldiers set fire to every building in the city. Every house. Every temple. Every library. Every warehouse. Everything. Carthage had been one of the wealthiest cities in the ancient world, filled with art, literature, scientific texts, architectural marvels. The Carthaginian library was said to rival Alexandria's. All of it burned. Ancient sources describe the smoke being visible from 50 miles away. The fire was so intense that the stone walls of buildings cracked from the heat. For 17 days, the city burned. And when the fires finally died out, Roman soldiers spent weeks tearing down anything that remained standing. They demolished every wall. They smashed every foundation. They filled in the harbor so ships could never dock there again. Then they did something that ancient historians argue about to this day, something so extreme that many scholars think it must be exaggerated or symbolic rather than literal. They salted the earth. The Roman senator Cato's grandson ordered tens of thousands of pounds of salt to be spread across the ruins of Carthage and plowed into the soil. Why salt? Because salt, in large enough quantities, makes land sterile. Nothing can grow. The soil becomes poisonous to plant life. Rome wanted to ensure that Carthage could never be rebuilt. That no crops could ever grow there. That the land itself would be cursed. Now, modern historians debate whether this actually happened or if it's symbolic language that later writers took literally. The ancient sources are unclear. But here's what we know for certain: after Rome finished with Carthage, the site remained completely abandoned for over 100 years. No one lived there. No one farmed there. The land was empty. When Rome eventually did rebuild on the site generations later, they built a Roman colony, not a resurrection of Carthage. But a completely new Roman city with Roman culture, Roman language, Roman laws. Carthaginian culture was gone. Erased. As if it had never existed. But here's where this story gets even darker, and here's why this qualifies as a forgotten war crime that historians still argue about today. The 50,000 survivors who were enslaved. Their fate reveals just how systematically Rome destroyed not just a city, but an entire people. In ancient warfare, enslavement was common. Conquerors took prisoners and sold them as slaves. It was brutal, but it was standard practice. But Rome did something different with the Carthaginian survivors. They deliberately separated families. Mothers were sold to buyers in Spain. Their children were sold to buyers in Greece. Husbands were sent to mines in Sicily. Wives were sent to households in Gaul. This wasn't accidental. This was policy. Roman records show that slave dealers were specifically instructed not to sell Carthaginian family members to the same buyer or even to buyers in the same region. Why? Because Rome understood that as long as Carthaginian families stayed together, Carthaginian identity would survive. Children would learn their language from their parents. They'd learn their history, their culture, their religion. But if you separate a mother from her children, if you scatter a people across an empire so vast they can never find each other again, their culture dies within a single generation. The children grow up speaking the language of their masters. They worship the gods of their masters. They forget the language of their parents. Within 20 years, Carthaginian culture effectively ceased to exist. We don't have Carthaginian literature because Rome burned their libraries. We don't have Carthaginian historical accounts because Rome killed everyone who could have written them. We don't even know what the Carthaginians called themselves in their own language because no one alive today speaks Punic. The language died out completely. Everything we know about Carthage comes from Roman sources. The people who destroyed them wrote their history. Imagine if the only thing future historians knew about your culture came from the people who annihilated it. How accurate do you think that history would be? Now let me tell you about one survivor whose story somehow made it into the historical record, probably because it was so dramatic that Roman writers couldn't resist telling it. Her name was Sophonisba. She was a Carthaginian noblewoman, approximately 35 years old when the city fell. According to the historian Polybius, Sophonisba had been married to a Carthaginian general who died during the siege. She had 3 children, 2 daughters and 1 son. When the Romans broke through the walls, Sophonisba made a choice that thousands of other Carthaginian women made during those final days. She killed her children. She poisoned all 3 of them. Then she poisoned herself. But the poison didn't work on her. It killed her children, but she survived. When Roman soldiers found her surrounded by her dead children, they dragged her to the slave markets anyway. Polybius writes that Sophonisba refused to speak. For weeks, she remained completely silent. She wouldn't respond to questions. She wouldn't beg for mercy. She wouldn't acknowledge her captors at all. The Romans found this disturbing. They were used to prisoners begging for their lives. Sophonisba's silence unnerved them. She was eventually sold to a Roman merchant who took her to Sicily. According to the account, she worked as a household slave for 3 years. Still silent. Never speaking a single word. Then one day, without warning or explanation, she walked into the Mediterranean Sea and drowned herself. She had waited 3 years for an opportunity to die on her own terms. This wasn't just one woman's tragedy. This was the story of thousands of Carthaginian women who chose death over witnessing what Rome had done to their civilization. Ancient sources mention that in the weeks after the fall of Carthage, the Roman soldiers had to constantly watch the enslaved women because mass suicides were happening daily. Women would throw themselves off buildings. They'd strangle themselves with their chains. They'd refuse to eat until they starved. The Romans couldn't understand it. From their perspective, they'd shown mercy by not killing these women. They'd been allowed to live, even if as slaves. But the Carthaginian women didn't see it as mercy. They saw it as a fate worse than death, being forced to serve the people who'd murdered their families and destroyed their entire world. But the destruction of Carthage wasn't unique in ancient history. It was just the most famous example of a practice that was terrifyingly common. Let me tell you about what happened to another city, one you've probably never heard of, Melos. Melos was a small Greek island city during the Peloponnesian War in 416 BC. The population was about 5,000 people. Athens, yes, the birthplace of democracy, the cradle of Western philosophy, the city of Socrates and Plato, decided it wanted Melos to join its empire. Melos refused. They wanted to remain neutral in the war between Athens and Sparta. Athens sent ambassadors to negotiate. The Melian representatives said they had the right to remain independent. The Athenian ambassador's response is recorded by the historian Thucydides in what's now called the Melian Dialogue. It's one of the most chilling exchanges in ancient literature. The Athenians said, "The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must." Not, we'll respect your independence. Not, we'll negotiate a compromise. Just, we're stronger than you, so we'll do whatever we want, and you'll suffer the consequences. Melos still refused. Athens besieged the island. After several months, Melos surrendered, expecting the usual terms, tribute payments, joining the Athenian alliance, maybe giving up some hostages. Instead, Athens executed every adult male in the city. Every single one. Approximately 1,500 men were killed in a single day. Then Athens enslaved every woman and child. The entire female population, probably around 3,000 women and children, was sold into slavery. Then Athens brought in Athenian colonists to repopulate the island as if Melos had never existed. This was Athens. The city we celebrate as the birthplace of democracy, philosophy, and rational thought. And they committed what we would today classify as genocide. But here's the most disturbing part. When news of what happened at Melos reached Athens, there was public debate about whether this had been the right decision. Some Athenians thought maybe they'd been too harsh. But the majority opinion? The majority of Athenian citizens thought the destruction of Melos was completely justified and necessary. The playwright Euripides was so disturbed by what his city had done that he wrote a play about it, The Trojan Women, depicting the suffering of women whose city had been destroyed. It was performed in Athens 1 year after the destruction of Melos. The Athenian audience watched a play showing the horror of what they'd just done to Melos. And they gave it first prize in the drama competition. They watched their own war crime performed as entertainment, and they applauded. The more you study ancient warfare, the more you realize that what Rome did to Carthage, what Athens did to Melos, these weren't exceptions. They were standard practice. Let me give you more examples, because the sheer scale of this needs to be understood. In 335 BC, Alexander the Great destroyed the city of Thebes in Greece. Thebes had rebelled against Macedonian rule. Alexander's response: kill 6,000 Thebans. Enslave 30,000. Burn the entire city to the ground except for one house, the house where the poet Pindar had lived, because Alexander admired his poetry. One house. That's all that remained of Thebes. In 209 BC, the Romans destroyed Tarentum in southern Italy. The city had sided with Hannibal during the Second Punic War. When Rome recaptured it, they enslaved 30,000 people and looted so much wealth that it supposedly took 3 days just to count all the gold. In 167 BC, Rome destroyed 70 cities in the region of Epirus in Greece as punishment for supporting Macedonia. 70 cities. 150,000 people were enslaved in a single military campaign. In 146 BC, the same year Carthage fell, Rome also destroyed Corinth, one of the wealthiest cities in Greece. Same pattern: kill the men. Enslave the women and children. Burn the city. Erase it from existence. The Roman general Lucius Mummius looted so much art from Corinth that it filled hundreds of ships. He took so many bronze statues that Rome's bronze industry was supplied with melted-down Corinthian art for decades. Are you noticing the pattern? This wasn't war as we understand it. This wasn't armies fighting armies for territory or resources. This was cultural annihilation as military strategy. The goal wasn't to defeat an enemy. The goal was to make sure that enemy could never threaten you again by completely erasing their existence. And it worked. We don't have Carthaginian literature. We don't have Carthaginian philosophy. We don't have Carthaginian science. We barely have Carthaginian names. An entire civilization that existed for over 650 years, that controlled most of the Mediterranean, that produced great generals and philosophers and architects, reduced to a footnote in Roman history books. But here's the question that haunts historians: why don't we talk about this? Why isn't the destruction of Carthage taught in schools alongside other historical atrocities? Why do we celebrate Rome as a great civilization, when they committed acts that by modern legal definitions would be classified as genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity? The answer is uncomfortable, because Rome won. And the winners write history. Think about what we know about Carthage. Almost everything comes from Roman sources. Livy, Polybius, Appian, all Roman historians or historians writing under Roman patronage. They describe Carthaginians as barbarians who practiced child sacrifice, who worshipped evil gods, who were fundamentally different from civilized Romans. Modern archaeology has found very little evidence for most of these Roman claims. But the stereotype persisted for 2,000 years because Rome controlled the narrative. We celebrate Roman engineering, their aqueducts, their roads, their architecture. We study Roman law as the foundation of Western legal systems. We read Roman literature and philosophy. But we don't talk about the fact that Rome built its empire on the systematic destruction of dozens of civilizations. And here's what makes it even more disturbing: the Romans themselves didn't hide what they did, they were proud of it. They commissioned monuments celebrating the destruction of Carthage. They held triumphs, massive public parades, where they displayed Carthaginian prisoners in chains and showed off looted treasure. The Roman people would line the streets cheering as enslaved Carthaginians were paraded through the city. This wasn't shameful, this was entertainment. Scipio Aemilianus, the general who destroyed Carthage, was celebrated as a hero. He was given the honorific title Africanus, the conqueror of Africa. No one thought what he'd done was wrong, and that's the truly horrifying part. It wasn't seen as a crime, it was seen as a triumph of Roman civilization. Let me tell you one more story, because I want you to understand what was lost when these civilizations were destroyed. In the ruins of Carthage, archaeologists have found fragments of Carthaginian libraries that survived the burning. These fragments are in Punic, the Carthaginian language, and we can barely translate them because so few people studied the language before it died out. But one fragment that has been partially translated is particularly haunting. It's from a Carthaginian agricultural manual written by a scholar named Mago. Before Rome destroyed Carthage, Mago's agricultural writings were considered the most advanced in the Mediterranean world. The Romans themselves recognized how valuable this knowledge was. After burning Carthage's libraries, they specifically saved Mago's agricultural texts and had them translated into Latin. Mago's work on farming techniques, crop rotation, and livestock management became the foundation of Roman agricultural science. But here's the thing: we don't have Mago's original texts. We only have Roman translations and summaries. And in those Roman versions, there's no mention of Mago's name after the first chapter. The Romans took his knowledge and claimed it as their own. One scholar's entire life work, stolen and credited to Rome. Now multiply that by thousands. Thousands of Carthaginian scholars, scientists, poets, philosophers whose work was either burned or stolen and rebranded as Roman achievement. Historians estimate that Carthage's libraries contained somewhere between 500,000 and 1 million scrolls. Almost all of them were burned. We'll never know what knowledge was lost. We'll never know what scientific discoveries, what mathematical innovations, what literary masterpieces disappeared in those 17 days of fire. It's like if an advanced alien civilization came to Earth, burned every library, every university, every hard drive and server, then wrote a history book saying humanity had nothing worth preserving. That's what Rome did to Carthage. And they did it so thoroughly that for 2,000 years, most people believed the Roman narrative that Carthaginians were barbaric and uncivilized. Only in the last 50 years have archaeologists begun to uncover evidence that Carthage was actually more advanced than Rome in many ways: their shipbuilding technology, their trade networks, their agriculture, their city planning. But we'll never know the full extent of what was lost, because the people who could have told us were killed or enslaved, and their books were burned. So why am I telling you this story? Because this is the forgotten war crime that no one talks about. We discussed the Holocaust. We discussed slavery. We discussed genocides of the 20th century. And we should. Those atrocities must never be forgotten. But we seem to have given ancient civilizations a pass. We treat the destruction of entire cultures in the ancient world as just how things were back then. But it wasn't inevitable. It wasn't necessary. It was a choice. Rome chose to destroy Carthage completely rather than simply defeat it. Athens chose to execute every man in Melos rather than accept their surrender. Alexander chose to burn Thebes rather than show mercy. These were deliberate decisions made by people who knew exactly what they were doing. And the fact that we celebrate these civilizations as the foundations of Western culture while ignoring the atrocities they committed should make us deeply uncomfortable. The little girl standing on the walls of Carthage in 146 BC watching the Roman army approach, she had a name. She had a family. She had dreams and fears and a future. We'll never know what happened to her specifically. She's one of 50,000 people who disappeared into Roman slavery and were never heard from again. But her story, and the story of Carthage, deserves to be remembered. Not to demonize Rome. Not to play oppression Olympics between ancient civilizations. But because the systematic destruction of entire cultures is always a crime, regardless of when it happened or who did it. And because if we don't remember these stories, we're complicit in the erasure that Rome started 2,000 years ago. This is stripped history. We don't look away. We don't let ancient propaganda replace truth. And we don't let civilizations be erased twice, once by conquest, and again by being forgotten. If you want more stories about the ancient world that challenge everything you learned in school, subscribe to this channel. Tell me in the comments, what other ancient civilizations were erased from history? What other stories deserve to be told? Because Carthage wasn't the only one. And these stories matter. Remember Carthage.